Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 231.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, I am back with another Kwik episode from Mr. Jim Kwik and his podcast, Kwik Brain. And this one is called Learn How to Unlock Limitless Creativity. Who doesn't want limitless creativity? And overcome resistance. Anyone who knows me knows why that would have caught my eye. And that's with somebody called Stephen Pressfield, who is an author and speaker. And he was on the podcast to promote his latest book, which is called The Daily Pressfield. And he is known apparently for helping entrepreneurs and creatives overcome resistance. And they really were I suppose, mostly talking to people who are embarking on a creative project or a new business, or who suffer with this problem of resistance. And I guess also it's really targeted to anyone who has to structure their own workday or their own creativity in some way without it sort of being forced upon them by a work environment. So that's why it appealed to me, really, because it is something that I struggle with. So Jim talked in the beginning about resistance as being an internal battle that keeps us from realizing our potential. But he asked Stephen Pressfield to define what he means by resistance. And he talks about it as being a negative force that for him radiates off the keyboard, holding him back from writing. He's an author, so that's his line of creativity. And he says it tends to come in two main forms. And the first one is this resistance comes in the form of distraction and procrastination. Both words that I'm very familiar with.
I was going to say things that neither you nor I can relate to at all.
Not at all, no. Every day. And the other main form is self-sabotage. And this resistance tends to undermining yourself. He says it's very defeating. And he named it resistance. And he realized that it wasn't his voice, but more of a universal force that tries to stop us fulfilling our creative acts. And he says that once he did that, he found that he could start getting over this force. And Jim asks him if resistance is highest at certain times, like at the start of a project, for example. And he cites the example of perfectionism as being a form of resistance. And Stephen Pressfield says, yes, absolutely. But he says there are predictable points in a project where resistance is likely to strike. And yes, the big one is before we've even started. And so you never actually get to start this creative endeavor that you want to embark on. And the voice in your head will say things like, well, have you thought about how long this is actually going to take? Have you thought about how much hard work is going to be involved? Have you really got time for it? I'm sure somebody else has already done it and they've probably done it better. Why bother with this? And he says this voice that we hear going on inside, we believe this to be our voice and we believe it to be objective in saying these things. But he says it's not. This is the negative force of resistance. And we need to find a way to dismiss it. His mantra that he uses all the time is start before you're ready. Because, he says, another form of resistance is doing research. Huge one for me. Yeah, this is why a lot of creative endeavors have never, ever got off the ground. We just need to get all our ducks in a row before we start. We've got to be perfect, or we've at least got to be, getting there as far as being an expert in our field before we can even think about starting. He says, no, start before you're ready. Do the research as you go along. And he says this resistance voice will be saying things like, well, you are working because you're doing research. So you are working towards this project. He says, but you aren't really. You're not actually starting on the project yet. You're getting stuck in this form of resistance. And Jim chimes in here and says, something that's worth reminding yourself is that every professional out there was once an amateur. Every expert was once a beginner. And they talk a little bit about where ideas come from. And this was quite interesting. This is where he sort of goes into, Stephen Pressfield, talking about, he sort of believes in this, it coming from somewhere else. He's a big believer in the Greek muses, and that it doesn't actually come from us. It comes to us from somewhere else. And he believes that we're assigned these ideas specific to us. Because he says, think about different people with their creativity. We don't all get the same ideas and the same things coming to us. And it made me think about, and I made a note to myself to Google before we started, and I completely forgot. What was that about forgetting some things and thinking you were going to remember to do something and not? That was last week. But there was that story, and I think it might have been you who've shared this before, but there was that story, wasn't there, about an author who she talks about an idea that kept coming to her. And for one reason or another, she didn't run with it. She didn't write that story. And it sort of came to her. It was like the universe tried a few times to give her this really good idea. And for one reason or another, she didn't. And then somebody else had the same, almost the exact same idea and wrote a very successful novel, I think it was. So I can't remember who it was, but...
Yeah, it's from Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic.
That's right.
And she did that. She had an idea. She started to develop it and then just never carried it through, dropped the plan. This is how I'm remembering it. Dropped the plan and then went and met with another author who was developing the same story.
That's right.
And it, it was clear to her what that meant was this had been offered to her a couple of times. She let it go. And it went on to another author. So yeah, like you said, it's, and I know that gets pretty woo-woo for a lot of us, but that idea that the creative thing needed to be created and it was just finding a host basically, and she passed it. And so it went on to someone else.
Yeah. And I think there must be a lot of people out there, especially if you've thought about various creative projects, and, a creative project can be anything, can't it? And we're not necessarily talking novels or art like that. It could be any kind of endeavor that you've got to create. But how many times have you sort of thought about something and then you almost, you sort of, and I've certainly done this, you miss the wave. And then by the time you really sort of get around to it, there are just too many other people doing it, or it's like, oh yeah, I missed the time. But the time was there, and if you'd have actually harnessed it when you were first thinking about it, start before you're ready.
Now, my idea on this, Daisy, may have already been in existence. I didn't research this as you were just talking, but when I was in college, I went to school at a very big campus, and we had very cold winters. And you would have to walk across campus 20, 25 minutes to get to class. And we called it the tundra. Like there was this one part you had to walk across. It was cold, windy. And I remember thinking, why don't we have like a scarf-like thing that comes up over your nose? Now, I didn't mean the whole face mask knitted thing.
Like balaclava type thing, yeah.
But then I realized, 15 years later, we do have those, Terry. But I don't know when we started really mass producing those. Maybe that was my ticket to creative, success, that I could have created one. But, I was an English major walking the tundra. I didn't have the wherewithal to actually design this thing that I was imagining.
Yeah. Well, there you go. See, missed opportunity that Mr. Balaclava harnessed instead.
Probably in like 1849 or something.
So the next, Jim is always good at asking questions. And the next thing he asks Stephen is about talent and effort. He was wondering, is there a ratio when it comes to creativity and success? And he says, yes, of course. Work is required. Hard work often is the answer. And he talks about, in his own experience, of how many decades of writing it took him before succeeding, before becoming a successful author. He really had to learn his craft. And, people do. They need to learn their craft to be able to really access their talent. And he talks about, what this really comes down to is the discipline of a daily practice and routine. And that is what has had the most significant impact on his creativity and output. Having this routine, a strict routine that avoids resistance. And creativity is often easiest within quite a strict structure. Often people think that creativity goes more hand in hand with spontaneity and going where the mood takes you, and more of this, plucking things out of the air and having to be a free spirit and open to these things coming to you. And of course, that does happen, and ideas often do come to you in more moments like that, when you're out walking the dogs or you're out doing something where your mind is not so focused on sort of trying to find something, where you can just let it wander around. But he says, with a simple routine-led life, you can put your energy into creativity. He says, interestingly, he's quite a willpower type person. I think most of us aren't, really. So Jim asks him really a bit specifically about his book, but do you have some tips about how to overcome resistance? And this is where, he says that he is quite a sort of willpower, crack the whip type person. But to think of your work day as a practice, something that you do every day without fail, at the same time, with intention, and think of it as a lifelong commitment, and it becomes part of who you are. And he uses the example of having a martial arts practice. And he says, there's a routine to this. You go to the dojo, you leave your shoes at the door, you go inside and you bow to the sensei, you bow to the room. It's a sort of sacred space that you're entering. And it's important that you leave your ego outside, you leave your troubles outside the door. So you go in there with some physical rules, but also your frame of mind, your intention to go in there to practice this martial arts practice. And talking a bit about this identity piece, making it part of who you are, he says with having this daily practice that's very grounding, but this practice becomes the evidence of who you are. So it feeds back in. And Jim just sort of finishes off going back to this. How do you balance routine and spontaneity? Stephen talks a little bit about freedom as we're sort of thinking of it there, that the sort of freedom to be spontaneous. He thinks that's really for when you're young, when you try all the things. And he says as he's got older, with the experience and with the things that you've tried when you're younger, you more find your calling, find your voice, and you have to practice that. And I wonder if that's why it's difficult for some of us who don't feel like we've properly found that voice yet. But that's a personal aside. But just quickly, his book, and I did have a look for it on Amazon. It is available as Audible, actually, but I had a quick listen and I wasn't blown away. And it's only available as quite an expensive hardback at the moment. But it does sound like quite a good book. He says it's done in a 365-day format, and it's made up of bite-sized little bits of motivation, inspiration, and encouragement. So quite a simple little podcast, really, just focusing around this idea of resistance. But it's something that I found personally quite relevant, and I know that I need more of a structure, and I certainly suffer from a lot of the forms of resistance. So yeah, I just thought that was quite interesting.
I like the part about the importance of a practice. And my guess is some people might hear that and think that's kind of counter to spontaneity. But I almost hear it like we need to provide a structure so that there are spaces for spontaneity to appear. Whereas when I think of when I am most procrastinating, most fumbling to catch up, there's very little room for creativity. Whereas if I did more of a routine and, more of, like you said, even about your work, just thinking of it just as this pattern, this practice that you do, that creates space for spontaneity to come in. Obviously, that means you don't necessarily have every 10 minutes of your day filled with an activity, but by having a structure, I think it creates openings. Whereas, like I said, I know when I am more catching up due to resistance, there's a lot less space for any creativity, spontaneity, anything positive like that to come in, because then it's just, nose to the grindstone, hurry, get this done, focus on it, don't do this, forget about doing that. Whereas, if I had a more consistent practice, I could have some space to invite other things in and try things out.
Yes, and he said that by, providing this quite simple routine, just frees up energy that allows you to be more creative and get more of these ideas flowing. And actually, when you were just saying that also made me think of, going back to your episode when you were talking about the sleep and the churning things over in your mind and being worried about stuff. I think that quite often some of that comes from not having a routine. So this idea of providing a structure not only frees up energy within that structure, but I wonder if also it frees up more mind wandering in those times with things like taking the dogs out for a walk, that instead of having things churning over in your mind that you're worrying about catching up, or worrying about this or worrying about that, it actually might free up that time for more of the creative stuff to come in. And I really liked that martial arts example that he used, the frame of mind and the intention that you go into this time, into this structure that you've created, into these routines, into this practice that you're developing, that it really becomes a part of who you are. And you go into it with putting your worries at the door, leaving those behind in this time that you've dedicated for it. So I do think there's quite a lot of fairly profound stuff in there, even though it was just a little bit, one of those things that was quite simple but got me thinking quite a lot, which is always a good thing.
It also had me thinking about something you and I talked about frequently, but really specifically in one episode when we were talking about the book Never Binge Again and that lower brain. And lots of authors talk about that lower brain in different ways. But here in this episode, they were talking about that resistance at the beginning that says, oh, really? Are you sure you're going to have enough time? That part of our brain that's kind of trying to protect us from anything uncomfortable out of fear that the payoff won't be worth it. And so, like you said, it creates that resistance. There's part of us that is really pushing against change, pushing against moving forward, would rather stay the same, even if staying the same is not in a comfortable place.
Yeah. And actually that reminded me, I sort of skipped a little bit where he talked about there were the predictable points where resistance will strike. And there is that obvious one at the beginning, that initial hurdle and the inertia that you get once you get going and you get the momentum. But also at the very end, as you're coming towards the end, you'd think it would be good then, but that can also be a real crisis point for resistance. And I guess that big bit in the middle, thinking of an episode that you recorded with Heather for the fasting method, when you just get, some people often, they're really fired up at the beginning of embarking on a weight loss journey or embarking on something, changing their health or whatever it is. Quite often, once you get over that initial resistance and you're fired up and you get going, that momentum really gets started. But it's when things start getting a bit tedious, a bit everything, you're all sort of a bit used to it and you're sort of plateauing out a bit or whatever it is, that's often a time, isn't it, where resistance comes in big time and where you have to sort of switch your focus.
Yeah.
And thinking about these things, making it part of your identity and approaching with intention and reminding yourself of why you're doing it and all sorts of things. So yeah, resistance can come along and bite your backside all sorts of times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's me hopefully maybe trying to apply some of that. I certainly am not very good. I blame Gretchen Rubin and the rebel tendency and the questioner as well for all the research I have to do. Only joking.
Well, she didn't create those in you, Daisy. She just helped you recognize
Exactly. But yeah, I do have this internal battle that goes on with fighting against a routine and structure. However, I know from experience that I do better when I actually do that. Mm-hmm. So yes, it just sort of got me thinking again and got me thinking about needing to rearrange things a bit. So yeah, we shall see. Hopefully it's helpful to some other people too.
Before we go, Daisy, I wanted to give you a quick update on something from a previous episode. It was an episode when you were talking about cold plunges and we were talking about just brown fat and white fat and all of those things. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try the cold shower or whatever, but I have to say I have not. However, it is getting cold here. And my oldest dog, Gracie, has to go out at very strange times. And I'm often wearing a tank top and shorts because that's what I sleep in. And then I have to get up at 2 a.m. and let her outside. So I sometimes will put on something, maybe a lightweight jacket or something, but I stand out there for a couple minutes and sometimes I forget to take shoes. So I'm standing on the cement of the patio and standing out there. And all I think about during that time is, oh, this is so good for me. This is helping with the brown fat. So have not started cold plunges or cold showers, but I definitely have been experiencing some colder temperatures on my skin for smaller segments of time. So making progress there.
Excellent. Who knew that Gracie would be the one to enforce these things? Good old Gracie.
Good old Gracie. This morning was rather brutal when she woke me up, but I have to be appreciative, I guess.
Think of the brown fat.
That's right.
Brilliant. Okay, well, until next time, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.